I'll try my best to give you a snapshot of what's going on in this paper, which, as Amelia said, is joint work with Alex de Corniel. So we are thinking in this paper about markets in which consumers buy a finished good from a downstream firm, and that downstream firm in turn creates that good by combining a series of components that are supplied by upstream firms. And in particular, we're going to look at the situation where there are two types of upstream component. What we call component M is monopolized by a single firm, by firm one. But then there's a second type of component, which we call C, which is supplied competitively both by firm one and by its rival firm two. And so if the downstream firm only has the need for one component of type C, that's going to give rise to some competition for slots for which C component gets included in the downstream product. And so within that broad framework, the basic questions that we try to address are firstly, can this firm one profit by bundling the two components that it controls together and saying to the downstream firm, well, you're only allowed to take component M if you also agree to give a slot to my version of component C. And secondly, what effect might that bundling have on the wider market? So as Amelia said, this work was initially motivated by the European Commission's Google Android case. In that case, we could think of the downstream firm as being a device manufacturer, and it has to choose when a consumer buys a new Android device, what will be the applications that are set as default on that device. And the Commission was concerned that Google had been saying to device manufacturers that if you want to install on your device the Google Play Store, which is by far the largest source of app installation and downloads, then you have to commit also to installing Google Search as the default search engine on the device. Indeed, under some forms of the contract, as the exclusive search engine on the device. But we could also imagine other situations that have this kind of structure. I'd say we could think of the downstream firm as being a retail store, and it's deciding which products does it put into the best shelf slots in its store. And the upstream firms could be the manufacturers of consumer goods, and we might be concerned that a firm would say, well, the only way that you're allowed to stock this popular brand M is if you agree to put my version of product C onto the best shelf. It's a very similar structure to the problem. So that's the broad outline of the situation that we try to study. We do that in an environment with two important features. The first of which we call retail complementarity. This is the idea that a downstream product which does have component M is going to be more valuable to consumers than one that doesn't have component M. And so the way that we formalize that in our framework is that we say, once the downstream firm has finished setting its prices, it's going to serve a number of consumers capital Q and earn a profit capital Pi if it does have component M, the monopolized component. But if it doesn't have that component, then it will serve fewer consumers, small q, and earn a lower profit, small pi. The second key ingredient is that the upstream firms are going to earn a positive markup when they interact with buyers of the downstream product. So this amounts to saying, for example, in the App Store example, that makers of smartphone apps will earn some sort of advertising or in-app revenue whenever a consumer uses their app through the device. In the retail context, it would amount to saying that the manufacturers of those consumer goods earn a positive markup when a consumer buys their product in the store. So because I don't have a lot of time today, I'm going to focus on the simplest possible case. I'm just going to assume exogenously that these smartphone apps, if you like, earn some revenue from interacting with consumers. In fact, for concreteness, for most of the talk, I'll assume that firm 2 is more efficient in the sense that it earns more revenue from interacting with a consumer. And then they just offer lump sum transfers to the payments to the downstream firm. So more generally, if we want to have these positive markups, it turns out that we're going to have some sort of contracting friction in the model. And I'll talk a little bit more about it later, but that contracting friction is really the key ingredient here. So with that framework, it's a very simple idea. So I think I can show you quite cleanly how the mechanism of the model works. We have two cases that we have to consider. The first is the case in which firm 1 chooses not to bundle its components together, meaning that the downstream firm can essentially choose a la carte which components it wants to adopt. In that case, we saw by assumption that the downstream firm earns some profit capital pi if it does have component M, but it only earns small pi if it doesn't have component M. And that means the most that the downstream firm would be willing to pay to be able to adopt this component M is the difference between those two profits, capital pi minus small pi. Over on the competitive market, by assumption, because firm 2, I said, was more efficient, it's going to be willing to pay more for the right to have its component in the downstream good. And the firms are going to anticipate that if this is a downstream good that has the monopolized component, then it's going to be bought by capital Q consumers. And so firm 2, in order to convince the downstream firm to take its component, it's going to have to pay more than firm 1 would be willing to pay. So it's going to have to pay at least R1 times capital Q. So that's already enough for us to characterize what profit the firms are going to be making in this type of environment. And the line that you should really focus on is the top one, which is the profit for firm 1 when it chooses not to bundle these two goods together. And so its C component isn't being chosen by the downstream firm, so there's no profit there. But it is selling the monopolized component at a price of capital pi minus small pi. And so firm 1's profit, therefore, is indeed capital pi minus small pi. That's the expression we have to keep in mind for just a moment, capital pi minus small pi. Now I want to compare that with the other case, which is where firm 1 chooses to bundle its components together. So now the downstream firm faces a choice. It can either install the bundle supplied by firm 1, which contains both its monopolized and its C component, or it could take just the C component from firm 2. And so given that that's the choice faced by the downstream firm, now firm 2 should anticipate that if it is ever chosen by the downstream firm, it's going to be by a downstream firm that does not have the M component. Right? That's an option. The combining M with firm 2's C good is an option that's ruled out by this bundle. And so firm 2 should anticipate that the demand for this downstream good will be lower, that only Q consumers will want to buy it. And so when firm 2 thinks about how much it would be willing to pay to get that valuable slot in the downstream good, it shouldn't pay more than its revenue multiplied by small q, the number of consumers it would expect to serve. And so if the downstream firm accepts that offer from firm 2, then its profit will have two parts. So firstly, it's a downstream firm that doesn't have the M component. So that means it's going to earn a profit of small pi, and then it gets this payment that's offered by firm 2, R2 times Q. And so the downstream firm will choose to adopt the bundle if this profit from choosing firm 2 is smaller than the profit from choosing the bundle. And the profit from choosing the bundle is the profit from being a downstream firm that does have component M, which is capital pi, minus whatever payment it has to make to firm 1. And so from this inequality, we can figure out what is the highest payment that firm 1 can demand and still have its bundle chosen by the downstream firm? The answer is capital pi minus small pi minus R2Q. So remember, when we looked at the case without bundling, firm 1 was charging capital pi minus small pi. Now it's charging actually less than that. This is actually a perfectly normal result in bundling, that if you're going to bundle your goods by tying the hand of your trading partner, you're going to have to compensate them from that. That compensation comes in the form of a lower price. But when we look at firm 1's profits, it's going to be given by that payment, capital pi minus small pi minus R2Q. But then now, because firm 1's C component is being adopted, firm 1 is going to get the revenue, the ad revenue, if you like, from consumers using that C component. And so firm 1's profits now are capital pi minus small pi, which is what we had in the no bundling case, plus some extra stuff. And if that extra stuff is positive, then it means that bundling here is causing the profits of firm 1 to increase. Okay, so that's going to be the case in particular when two things happen. Firstly, we need R1 to be reasonably close to R2. So that is to say, we need firm 1 not to be too much less efficient than its rival. And secondly, we need capital Q to be sufficiently large compared to small q. Or in other words, we need this monopolized component to be really important to consumers when they choose whether to buy this downstream product or not. If those two things are satisfied, then the bundling is profitable. Why is it profitable? Well, it's because bundling basically puts firm 2 into the position where it anticipates that it can't be part of a downstream product alongside M, and that reduces firm 2's willingness to compete to be adopted within that downstream product. And so it essentially has the effect of softening the competition for slots that's faced by firm 1. That's going to be the case whether firm 2 leaves the market or not. So even if we see in light of bundling that competitors persist in being present in the market, it doesn't necessarily indicate that bundling isn't having this effect. So I sort of loaded the dice a bit by starting with the case where firm 2 is more efficient. And of course, their bundling results in an inefficiency because it results in the less efficient firm having its component installed. But I could equally have started with the assumption that firm 1 is more efficient. And then what we would find is that bundling continues to be profitable, but it's not inefficient anymore. It doesn't result in inefficient exclusion. Maybe just in the last minute or two, I finish with a couple of remarks of where we take this idea in the paper. So I showed you the sort of very simplest version of the story. Of course, in practice, we would expect that firms use much richer forms of contracting than those I presented here. So the second half of our paper really looks at much more general two-part tariff contracts where firms can pay both a per consumer royalty and a lump sum transfer. And what we find is that then bundling ceases to be profitable, right? Because I took away this contracting friction that I said would be important, and firms will therefore contract to the point where there are no positive markups anymore. However, we can very easily reintroduce new types of friction into the model. So in the paper, we use moral hazard as an example. And what we find is that the markup reemerges and we get, again, the same kind of results that bundling is profitable. Lastly, I showed you a model with a monopoly downstream firm. If we have competition downstream, then we get a new interesting thing happening, which is that the downstream firms can differentiate themselves by choosing to adopt different combinations of components. And bundling is going to prevent them from doing that and force them to install the same components. That's bad news for consumers in the sense that it will reduce the variety of components on offer, but it could be good news in the sense that it commoditizes the downstream good and thereby intensifies downstream competition. So that's a very brief tour of the paper. I hope if you're interested, you'll take a look. It's on my website. And I guess I should stop there and let somebody else speak.
Thank you very much, Greg.
Let me just give a quick snapshot of the labor market and what's happening in this particular market as a way of stimulating your thinking about why Greg's insights are bundling as well as contracting are important to the general topics that we earlier around MSN. Let me just quickly start with what is the market for GDS and what does it do? I think everybody here knows that it's the platform that sits between airlines that wish to sell tickets and airlines and travel agents that are buying tickets on behalf of their travelers, but in specific on behalf of business travelers. And the fact that they're business travelers is actually a really key piece of the market structure, which is important. This market has evolved over time, so it's actually a mature market. So at the margin, there are very few externalities, platform externalities that can now be captured, and that's true on for the GDS itself, as well as for travel agents and for airlines. So the question is, well, how are these entities? If the status quo remained, nothing would change. But airlines and travel agents are both competing for customers, and airlines are actually pursuing a strategy now of two types. One is unbundling, and then the second is to provide a higher level of service with travelers, and that both of those pieces to deliver value to customers have to be integrated with travel agents. And so innovators have come in to provide that solution. So it's an HTML-based solution. Farelogix is kind of the one that's been in the press most recently because of Sabre looking to acquire Farelogix, which the CMA said no to. And it said no to that merger because of this innovation element. And the innovation is around how do we meet the unbundling needs, desires of the airlines, trying to provide a better product for their travelers. And so, the question then becomes, as it relates to the earlier topics in the conference, what has Sabre done, as well as the other GDS? What have they done in order to respond? Well, most importantly, they've actually engaged in MFNs and contract preventions that have that effect, whereby Farelogix and the airlines aren't able to offer the unbundled product that they wish to provide to business travelers. And so that's a really key feature of the market, which isn't typically captured in platform papers, because it's really around platform disintermediation and the creation of new platform alternatives, which may actually look much more like the vertical market structure that Greg's paper is pointing to. So what I find very interesting about the paper that we just were looking at is that it does, in a pretty important way, point to if unbundling, if attribute competition is where consumers are most interested, and that's where the technological innovation starts to go, then that is a really important way of reducing the market power of platforms. And so to me, there's actually a very interesting interface between the ideas that Greg has presented and the kind of traditional ways that economists in a partial equilibrium setting have looked at platform economics. And so if we go back to the litigation that's been happening with the GDS, much of it goes back to these very simplistic partial equilibrium results that try to explain this the price structure that's there, where you have airlines who pay GDS a fee, and then the GDS makes a very large payment to the travel agent to essentially convince them to not go with the better product that's being offered through the innovator, and the innovator being the airline website and Farelogix. So it's I think Greg's paper is pointing in an important direction that platform theorists probably need to go as well, because it's really pointing to why in a regulatory setting and a litigation setting, the partial equilibrium results that underlie most of the analysis that you see in courts, which I would say are about 20 years out of date with where the literature is, really lead to very bad outcomes, in the sense that you lock in consumers having to use, potentially having to use dinosaur technology. So if you look at what Sabre and Travelport and Amadeus provide as a platform for travel agents, hotels, airlines, railroads, and so on, it's a very antiquated product relative to, for instance, the actual policy example that Greg was analyzing, which relates to cell phone technology and app developers. And so if you were to take a modern view, as Greg is, I think it would be very helpful to then apply that in these antiquated settings. And I think another antiquated setting is the payment card industry as well, where there's a ton of potential innovation that is there that is getting shut down by MFN type clauses, and the defense of these MFN clauses are based upon, as I say, these partial equilibrium results that 2 decades ago spawned an interest in platforms, platform economics, but are now completely antiquated.